For time beyond measure, the vast land we call Africa has concealed the answers to mankind's eternally tantalizing question, where did I come from? Now this storehouse of knowledge has begun to divulge its precious secrets, largely because of one man, a rebel and a heretic. He opened a door, led the way, and inspired others to follow.
Olduvai Gorge gives us one of the most remarkable stories of the past, the last chapter of the Earth's history, starting from the present day, right away back 2 million years. Here we're standing at the very top of the series, and up here where the grass is growing and the plants are growing represents written history, the time of the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, the time of the pyramids, the time of man developing to the present day. And here beneath it, in this 2 feet of this hard rock, we have the whole of the time that we recognize of man in America. The last 15,000 years are here. These grey beds here, beneath the hard blocky 15,000, are old beds formed in a lake. They're full of fish bones and hippo remains and crocodiles. And man was living here in this, what we call bed 4, making his tools and developing slowly towards what eventually became you and me.
Climbing down the rocks of Tanzania's Olduvai Gorge, Leakey walks backward in time. Each foot of his descent rolls back about 6,000 years of history. In future histories, the 2 names will be forever linked. Olduvai, the Grand Canyon of evolution, and Leakey, who for 30 years struggled to unlock its secrets.
And now I'm down at the bottom of the gorge. My feet are resting on the black lava which formed the old land surface on which these lake beds formed. And here behind me are the earliest part of the Olduvai series, deposits that were formed just nearly 2 million years ago. It was here that in 1931 we first found examples of simple tools like this, just a water-worn pebble with a jagged cutting edge. Stone tools that go back to a very, very remote past in time, nearly 3 times as old as anything previously found. Who were the men who made these tools? Where did they live, and how did they live? And that was a problem that Mary and I went out to look for. We wanted the answer. Who were these men?
He always struck me as somebody perhaps with more drive and enthusiasm and dedication than anybody else that I'd ever met. He just radiated confidence. He knew he must find something significant.
Lewis was completely fearless. He did the most extraordinary things throughout his life. Oh, well, Leakey was one of those incredible people. I mean, he had a magnetism, a charisma, an enthusiasm about him. He was quite a showman, a sort of natural press agent for anthropology.
I think Lewis will always be regarded as one of the great discoverers of our time. He had a genius for discovering things.
Lewis made fantastic contributions to our total stockpile of fossil evidence bearing on human evolution. He made sense where there was none before.
A passionate quest for knowledge. A legacy of Louis Leakey. The idea that Africa might be the cradle of mankind was first put forth by Darwin in the late 19th century, but for decades remained largely ignored by the scientific establishment. Africa was the dark continent, much of it unexplored, inhabited by strange animals and primitive exotic peoples. No one knew the evidence was there. No one knew how and where to look. It'd be like searching for an individual grain of sand on a broad expanse of beach. A challenge eventually met by a man sprung from African soil. Louis Seymour Bassett Leakey was born in a mud-walled hut about one day's walk from Nairobi, now the capital city of Kenya. His parents were Anglican missionaries, poorly paid volunteers determined to bring Christianity to the heathen Kikuyu tribe. Even in their remote outpost, they struggled to give their 4 children a solid Victorian upbringing in the traditions of their English homeland. With children of Kikuyu warriors as playmates, Louis learned the ways of the wilderness and the Kikuyu language. Later, they would adopt him into the tribe and call him the black man with a white face. As an adolescent, Louis prepared to follow his father's footsteps to Cambridge. He persuaded university officials to accept Kikuyu to fulfill a foreign language requirement, and then taught the language to the instructor assigned to examine him. Along the way, he abandoned thoughts of missionary work, deciding that anthropology would be his field.
During my last year of study at Cambridge in 1926, I started making plans for raising funds to go back to my own home country, Kenya, and look for early man. It was absolutely universally believed at that time that it was Asia that had been the home of origin, the cradle of the human race. I told my professors about my plan and asked them to help me raise the money. Without exception, they told me that it was a waste of time to return to Kenya. I was just being mad in saying, no, I'm going to East Africa. I explained that I had reason to believe there might be something there, because in my childhood I had picked up quite a lot of stone tools. And in the end they shrugged their shoulders and said, all right, go for one season, but you'll soon find it's no use.
I suppose he had a good many snubs at Cambridge in the early days, and this wild man out of the bush, so unlike anybody else, and never any money, very little formal education. He was never educated at a school until he was 16 and a half, and I dare say he had to put up with quite a lot of unpleasantness sometimes from his fellow undergraduates at Cambridge. So maybe it was this chip on his shoulder that made him yearn to prove himself. He had tremendous ambition, of course.
In the late 20s and early 30s, Leakey managed to raise funds for several expeditions to East Africa. During this period, he received his doctorate from Cambridge, married, and fathered 2 children. Almost from the beginning, controversy colored some of his professional achievements. In remote and rugged areas of Kenya, he uncovered important animal fossils and definite traces of early man. But the scientific establishment rejected many of his interpretations of his finds. The scorn of his peers seemed to strengthen Leakey's determination to prove man's African origin. Subsequent divorce and remarriage, scandalous acts in many eyes, further alienated some of Leakey's academic colleagues. His second wife, Mary, an experienced archaeologist, shared his enthusiasm, energy, and dedication. Together, they doggedly pursued the creature that had made those provocative stone tools. After World War II, whenever they could raise the money, Louis and Mary again and again made the arduous trip to Olduvai Gorge. Scientific curiosity had become an obsession. The search would consume nearly a quarter of a century.
We never thought of giving up at Olduvai Gorge. Neither of us ever got at all discouraged because we made finds that seemed very rewarding. As we went along over the years, we found plenty to satisfy ourselves and to make us realize that there was still a great deal to be discovered in East Africa. Lewis would make decisions and make up his mind about things without really any valid reason that one could put one's finger on, and very often he was right. Again, very often he was wrong, but he certainly did have tremendous intuition on occasion. I think if we'd been both the same type of personality, it would have been very much more difficult. I think it was a very happy combination from work point of view, certainly, and many others too, but the combination of attention to detail and rushing to conclusions worked extremely well.
It was one day in July 1959 we made our great discovery. I was in camp that day, and Mary had gone out early in the morning and was continuing our long search up and down the cliffs. About 11 o'clock, nearly time to give up because the sun was very hot, she suddenly saw a little fragment of bone on the surface of the scree of a slope. She went up and brushed away, and there were two teeth sticking out of the rock. Her excitement was terrific. She rushed back to the camp and told me what had happened. I've got it, she said. I became magically well in a matter of moments and went down with her. And sure enough, there were these teeth sticking out. It took weeks to dig them out. They were all in tiny pieces, nearly 400 of them. We appeared to have got what we were looking for. Here at last was a man or a man-like creature found in direct association with simple chopping stone tools. Nothing comparable, either as early or as crude, had ever been found before. Apparently the earliest known man in the world, Zinjanthropus. This was our great discovery at Aldeby. It was only a few months later, and while Mary and I were still working on the Zinjanthropus site, that our son Jonathan, about 100 yards away, discovered another very important human fossil. First he found this lower jaw, the lower jaw of a child about 11 years old whose wisdom teeth had not yet appeared. That's how we can get its age. They were great, massive teeth, and very exciting because they were quite unlike the teeth of Zinjanthropus. And nearby, as we started working there, we got parts of the top of the skull, the vault. It proved to be the skull of a child whose brain was infinitely bigger than that of the grown-up Zinjanthropus. What did this mean? Here was quite clearly a different kind of man, living side by side with and contemporary with Zinjanthropus. About a year later, one of our workmen uncovered a single tooth at another site, about a mile away. Following that clue up, we got first of all another lower jaw, and then large parts of a skull. And this skull proved to be of the same general type, thin and small compared with Johnny's child, but that's because it's a female. But nevertheless, of the same general group. Now we had two different examples of a creature much more likely to be a true ancestor of you and me, and pushing back Zinjanthropus from his status of possibly the earliest man to merely an earliest cousin.
In 1965, we had finished our work on Zinjanthropus, the magnificent skull that Mary had discovered 5 or 6 years earlier, and Lewis believed it was correct for us to return the fossils to the country from which they'd come. And so Lewis had assembled an illustrious international galaxy of personalities from China, Russia, France, England, and of course the States, to see Lewis and Mary hand over to the President of Tanzania the most ancient Tanzanian. That's what Zinj really was. Working with Lewis had its ups and downs. There were times when his inspirational aura overwhelmed one, and one was fired to work with tremendous verve and industry and enthusiasm. It wasn't always easy. He had his difficult times, there's no doubt about it. Many of his colleagues found him difficult. But I think a man of that immense intellectual stature who tended to see the milestones well ahead of most other scientists, is likely not to find favour with all of his colleagues, especially with those who are the more cautious, run-of-the-mill kind of scientist, the chap who erects his hypotheses just a few millimetres down the road rather than a couple of miles ahead of us.
Although some colleagues called him the abominable showman, Leakey reveled in his ability to dramatize the emergence of mankind.
After man had learnt to walk upright and so freed his hands from making tools, and after he developed more and more brain power, he began to start thinking and planning how to use other things around him. Unfortunately, most of those things are perishable materials, and we have no perfect record from the materials themselves of what he used. But we can guess a good deal, and probably accurately, from the things that he caught. We know he must have caught fish because we find fish remains and remains of small animals that he snared on the living floors. And so we can begin to guess that as his hands became free and more capable of precision work, then we are pretty certain one of the things he first started to do was to make cord. You see, you can make cord just with nothing but your bare hands. You go into the bush, you can pick up the necessary wood cord making out of bark without any weapon at all, and then having done that, it's just a matter of peeling the bark from the saplings, a very simple action like that, and then separating the outer bark from the inner bark, because the outer bark is terribly brittle and the inner bark is not. It takes a little learning how to do it, but you can separate the outer bark from the inner bark, and once you've got that separated, then you've got the perfect material for making really strong cord and string and twine that's suitable for any of the purposes you could possibly imagine the man might want it: trapping, snaring, and the rest. Now, having got his inner bark separated out, the next thing was simply with his fingernails to fray it off into thin strips. This is material of the most extraordinarily strong and durable nature, especially when it's been turned into actual string. This same stuff has to be frayed a little. And man had in his own teeth the most perfect decorticator. Nowadays, of course, this sort of thing is done by machinery. But with his hands and his teeth, it's possible to fray that inner bark quite reasonably well. And then comes the last stage. Also, it looks, and is in fact, very, very simple. Separate them out into two separate groups. And then proceed as follows. It's quite simple. It's not as easy to do on one's trousers as it would be on a bare leg. But I'm rather a bit too hairy for that. That's better. Now by that process, it's going very nicely now. You can roll your cords up and produce a twine of any thickness you like. And there close up you can see the way the cord is done. Now if you want to make it thicker, you can make it as thick as a rope. And with this sort of thing, man could make his boulder stones, his weapons of offense for attacking animals at a distance. He could make snares and traps, even snares and traps big enough to catch quite large animals. He had in fact something available, requiring no tools to make it, which made him an even further master of his environment. When I first began to find stone tools here in Alderley Gorge, some 30 years ago now, I realized I'd got to begin to find out how they made these tools and how they used them. That would be the only way in which I'd get inside their minds and perhaps eventually find the people who made them. And so I started to teach myself how to make these tools. We've always been awfully wise to know how on earth they first got the idea of making a sharp cutting edge like this or this. It's just one of those things we didn't know. We suspect. First of all, long before they made a tool, they'd pick up a natural sharp cutting edge and use that. And then one day, probably, a man was breaking open a marrow bone, using a hammer stone to hit against the bone resting on another stone, and accidentally he knocked off a flake through a false blow on his bone. And that gave him the idea. That made him realize that by hitting one stone against another, he could knock off sharp flakes. And those sharp flakes would be usable both as tools themselves, and also the things he knocked the flakes off would have sharp edges too. There the first flakes off, you see. Now we're beginning to get a sharp, jagged edge here. And these flakes that I've knocked off are also useful too. They were never thrown away. They too had a use when it came to skinning animals. And that is probably what man did. Because once he'd got a sharp cutting edge like that, then he was superior to all the animals around him. He had something which would cut through skin and cut through flesh, and so could make use of the flesh of animals as part of his food supply. In this way he became gradually not only a survivor, but the master of all other things. All the wild animals had to do exactly the same in order that they were to survive. And they survived by specialization. And the whole story of evolution is a story of specialization to make it possible to survive, or of course over-specialization just kill them off. And it was these things, tools and brain, that made man man.
Leakey never seemed to run out of ideas, nor the vitality to pursue them. As curator of the Nairobi Museum, he made himself available to anyone seeking his advice and guidance. One caller was a young Englishwoman interested in studying wild animals. Her name was Jane Goodall.
I very clearly remember the first time I met him. I was in Nairobi. I'd saved up my money and got there. And I heard about Lewis after I got to Nairobi, and I thought, well, clearly here's somebody I must meet, someone who's interested in animals. So I rang up the museum. A voice said hello, and I said, well, I'd like to make an appointment to meet Dr. Leakey. And the voice said, I'm Leakey, what do you want? Which took me aback slightly. So I said I wanted to see him and why. And, well, it was a piece of great good fortune. His secretary happened to be leaving. And he said, well, would you like to come and work here at the museum? Which, of course, was fantastic for me. So I worked for him for a year and then went back to England, trained myself as much as I could while he tried to find money. He knew I had patience, and that really is the most important thing to have. He didn't clutter me up with a whole lot of rules, say do it this way, do it that way. He really said get there, and I'm sure you'll find a way of doing it. I think he was way ahead in his visions, and certainly when he began talking to me, it was quite clear that he hoped that understanding the behavior of these man-like creatures would give clues as to the behavior of early man. That was his very strong conviction. The chimp study's now gone on for 15 years, and it's interesting that when I first got to Gombe, Lewis said to me, you'll be there for 10 years, Jane. And I kind of smiled and thought, me buried in Gombe for 10 years? No way, you know. Now, 15 years later, I'm still there, very much in spirit, even though I can't be there all the time.
Dr. Leakey came to Louisville to give a talk, and I had written by then several articles, including one of Old Eye. He couldn't care less about it. After his talk, he threw the whole thing aside, and he picked up the gorilla article and said, you've been to the gorilla country.
And he said, will you come and talk to me tomorrow morning? I'm looking for someone to do guerrilla work. And we talked. The first thing he says is you will have your appendix out. Because when you're in the bush, when you really got in agony, sometimes it could be your appendix and it could be fatal. And you wouldn't want to be responsible for this. So days later, I received a letter from Dr. Leakey saying, wait on the appendix. There are other applicants. But by then it was out. It was really his way of testing it.
In March of 1969, I attended a lecture by Dr. Leakey. During the question and answer period, somebody asked about primatological studies, and Dr. Leakey talked about Diane Fossey's work, and Dr. Leakey just caught on fire. He was very charismatic. Immediately after this lecture, I charged up to him, and I told him that I wanted to study the orangutan. And at the time I didn't know it, but he was already searching for someone to do an orangutan study. When the opportunity finally came, I just couldn't believe it. We had struggled and labored so long to obtain the necessary funding and the necessary permissions. It was just like a dream coming true. And of course it was all due to Dr. Leakey.
From the earliest childhood days, all of our three sons, Jonathan, Richard and Philip, have been on safari with us. And as soon as they were able to, they began to understand something about stone tools and the collecting of fossils. Each of them has contributed something quite important in the way of discoveries while they've been working with us. It's therefore extremely happy for Mary and me to know that Richard is going to go on and continue in our footsteps.
I think as a small child I was bored by the whole thing. I think this is probably a natural reaction. After leaving school I decided that I'd rather do something different, do more what I wanted to do myself. I've always had a nagging in the back of my mind that what I had been doing was not in fact what I wanted to do. And the last 3 or 4 years I've realized that what I want to do is research into paleontology, which is what my parents have done. And this is what I'm now going to do. I'm very, very interested in this, and I think I have a tremendous opportunity with the background that I have. Probably the main fascination is this business of searching for something unknown. You're looking for something, you don't know exactly what you're looking for. Most of the things you find are new. You're creating new problems for yourself, which entail the finding of new facts again to solve these problems. It's a great big challenge. You can never win. You're always going on. This to me is very exciting and something I enjoy greatly, and I hope to do this the rest of my life.
Richard Leakey's discoveries at Lake Turkana in northern Kenya, along with finds by other scientists elsewhere in Africa, have upset several established ideas about human ancestry and confirmed some of Louis Leakey's theories. Work still going on suggests that early man and a mysterious creature like man lived side by side on the African savanna, and early man is much older than previously thought. Continuing at Olduvai and other sites in Tanzania, Mary Leakey also is making finds that push human evolution ever further back in prehistoric time. In announcing new discoveries, she must fight her natural shyness and reticence. Reluctantly, she assumes her late husband's accustomed spot in the glare of publicity.
When we got the positive absolute dates from Dr. Curtis, they proved to be bracketed between 3.35 million years and 3.75 million years. Now these are good, firm dates. And Dr. Curtis, who is an extremely cautious scientist, has said to me that go ahead and use them. They are watertight dates. And this, of course, gives tremendous importance to the two mandibles and the other remains of the hominids which we found, because they are now the earliest firmly dated hominid remains anywhere in the world.
Over a period of years, beginning in 1963, there developed in Southern California one of the most controversial elements of the Leakey legacy.
Everybody's been looking for early man in America for a long time, and we've now got a site down in the Calico Mountains. That was pure scientific detective work. It had to be a place where, at the relevant time, there were the three essentials for man: water, the right kind of stone to make stone tools, and animals to hunt.
Shown some old-looking artifacts in the Calico Mountains near San Bernardino, Leakey had another of his intuitive flashes. He picked a spot and said here would be found traces of early man. Again, Leakey was proposing heresy. The established view put the age of man in America at about 15,000 years. Leakey said it was 100,000, perhaps even older. The site was excavated with meticulous care, and Leakey convened a distinguished group of scientists for first-hand examination. At issue were two main points. Had any of the excavated stones been actually shaped into tools by man, and if so, how old were they?
That I have never seen nature produce. My terrible stuff in.
Yes, the bard's gone.
The bard has been trimmed away subsequently by trimming across, but the area is still there. I can't see nature doing that.
There's a tremendous variation in the size of these impact points.
So that again is entirely in consonance with if you hit a bone on there that you were smashing up. To me.
Or of course, I mean, it could equally well be natural. It's a question of the association of this with other.
I personally have never seen nature produce that, and I've looked for pretty years. I don't say couldn't have. To me, nothing is impossible. Where impossible doesn't exist. To me, that is much more than random hitting by pebbles. However, don't say their name for it. I want your own conclusion.
I remember just after he had one of his heart attacks, and I went to see him in hospital, and he talked about it then, that this was the earliest man in America, earlier than anybody could possibly dream of, and he was obviously completely convinced by it, in spite of what all his colleagues had said. And in the famous Calico meeting, of course, everybody had such affection for Lewis, and he was in poor health, and nobody really wanted to disappoint him, and perhaps they didn't speak out as much as they would have for anybody else. Some of them, of course, criticized it, but most of them said, well, maybe, just to keep Lewis happy. He would say, they'll come round to it. More and more people coming round to it. More and more will come to see that I'm right and they're wrong. That's all he'd say. He was just convinced they would see that he was right in the end.
I cannot see, honestly, how any substance of nature would do that. But if it did do it once, it wouldn't do it all these times as well in the concentration. I can't see it. But I'm merely stating why I think we are home, why this has to be done by man.
Leakey exerted all his persuasive powers. For the most part, his colleagues were quiet and polite, but their faces reflected lasting skepticism. If there was a consensus, it was that the old stones had not been shaped by man. But Leakey's faith never wavered. The Calico controversy remains.
I believe on the law of statistical average, for nature to have produced all those just there and been selective in material is a bit difficult.
Calico was a thorn in everybody's side in many respects. The whole business of early man in the New World is a very difficult subject, and one which has a great deal of passion involved with it on behalf of American archaeologists. I really went to the initial meeting at Calico because he frankly twisted my arm. The whole matter was frustrating. And clearly it was frustrating to Lewis. It was a disappointment for him. There's no question it was a disappointment. He was the kind of person who could never believe for a moment that he hadn't been successful in something, that if he hadn't achieved it, that he was on the brink of achieving it.
And towards the end, of course, he spent an enormous amount of energy raising funds in America in order that the work should go on. Lecturing, talking, rushing around seeing people. He really killed himself raising money with all his lectures. And he adored basking in the sunlight there. He was the center of attention, and he had to appear at dinners and go to parties, and he loved the whole thing. A lot of his friends and family criticized this and said, that, where was Lewis the scientist? What was he doing, being a sort of film star? But I always thought, if he enjoyed it, why shouldn't he have a little fun towards the end?
He was quite a showman, a sort of natural press agent. And because he was a generous man, he, in many ways, boosted the fundraising for all kinds of anthropology, especially archaeology, in the process of raising funds for his own projects. Leakey was one of those incredible people. I mean, he had a magnetism, a charisma, an enthusiasm about him. He filled a room.
Leakey's charm and prestige inspired a group of wealthy Americans, most of them in California, to organize the LSB Leakey Foundation. With Lewis the star attraction, the group sponsored lectures and social events to raise money for scientific research by Leakey and his protégés, and for pet projects like Calico and a primate center near Nairobi. In 1970, while in London recovering from a heart attack, Leakey appeared in a series of films made by the foundation. They were made both to raise funds and to allow future generations to experience the colorful spectrum of Lewis's interests.
Okay, action. All over the English-speaking world, both in this country and over in America, the idea of string figures, as we call them, is linked with cat's cradles, a children's game. In fact, children like my grandchildren here, Alison and Andrew, come across these things at school, and they are thought to be indigenous English-speaking things. In point of fact, that's not true. The so-called English cat's cradle, which is like this, come on, let's do one, is not, in fact, English at all. It was brought into England from China and Korea. Some figures are absolutely universal, and we have a strong suspicion that it's like the bow and arrow, which also has a common source and spread over the whole world, and that at some point, maybe 10,000 years ago, somebody started moving out over the world, taking with them bows and arrows, and this figure. In America, it's called the Apache door flap. The Navajo called it a door. The Eskimo called it a net, so the Tasmanians. Whereas in Africa today, it's known as the bed. It looks very much like a bed. Now, for a thing to be as universal as that, one has to assume it started a long time ago. And I have found string figures exceedingly useful in Africa at various times. In fact, your grandmother and I very nearly had a very exciting time, and we nearly died if we had 10 string figures.
Well, when and how?
1929 was the time. I was invited to go down in a lorry from East Africa to Johannesburg for a conference. It was a long journey by lorry and car, and we'd taken all kinds of spare parts, and we were stuck in what's now called Zambia. It used to be called Northern Rhodesia in those days. We broke down, the back axle broke. We couldn't move, and there was nothing to do. I hadn't got a spare part. And various people were coming up and down the road, backwards and forwards. And I kept saying, Jambo, Habari, which is Swahili in Kenya. Nobody understood a word. I saw a very well-dressed young man, I said, "Good morning, can you help me, please?" He just he pretended he didn't know, couldn't understand what I was saying. And then quite suddenly I was watching, and there was an old, little, shriveled up old woman, about 70, and she put her finger into her waistbelt like that, and she came out with a bit of string. She started doing a string figure. So then I moved up close to her, and I started watching, and she did a string figure very, very quickly. And I made signs for her to do it again, and I got my string ready, and I was starting to follow her, and follow her movements. And she didn't just start the ordinary opening, she did that, which is an opening I'd never seen in Africa before. And then she went on, and I was watching, and she produced this figure and held it up to me. And I then managed, after several tries, to get it right. And when I had done that, and finally I showed it to them like that. And then this young gentleman in European dress who pretended he didn't know what to do, he said, "Oh, sir, I think you were wanting some help." I said, "You know I damn well was."
But grandfather, you haven't mentioned your own tribe, the Kikuyu.
No, I haven't, because they don't do string figures. For some reason I don't understand, there's not a single string figure amongst my own tribe, but instead of that they do enormous numbers of tricks with string. They put a string around your neck like that, they put it right round so it's tight, and then they put it round all over again like that, and then they say, "Now watch," and the string comes off.
Looking at the face of Louis S.B. Leakey over the years, aware of his many talents, the complexities and contradictions of his character, the observer asks the questions that Leakey himself posed so many times during his search for the origins of Homo sapiens. Who was he? What made him what he was?
People say that he was dedicated to the glorification of Leakey. I don't think it was that. It was that partly, but above all it was science. He felt this sort of missionary zeal. His parents, of course, were missionaries, and he felt this missionary zeal to teach. And that was one of his great gifts, to inspire other people, particularly the young, and to teach them. He wanted to find out more. He wanted other people to join in his quest for the origins of man.
This enormous tenacity of purpose, I don't know exactly what motivated him. I think that it was a personal ambition to find the oldest and the most significant kind of creature in this whole field of early man. I think that you must obviously be motivated by something which will keep you going year after year, when you're sure that there must be something to be found, but you just can't find it. And I think that in Lewis's case, it was a personal ambition, a driving personal ambition to find something of real significance in this field. And that's as good an ambition as any.
There's no question about it that Lewis was completely fearless, and he did the most extraordinary things throughout his life, both on safari and in the bush, and I don't think he ever considered that he was likely to die under any circumstances. He considered himself immortal, I think.
He'll be regarded as a very essential figure in the whole of the development, not merely of anthropology, but also of whatever understanding there is between the races in Africa, because he lived there and stayed there, and created things that the countries themselves could be proud of in their relationship to the whole history of man. Well, there are very few people who are going to have the opportunity of doing it on such a wide scenario as that.
Right now, people still regard him very highly as one of the great Kenyans that has ever lived. He was one of the major, persons to break up the former colonial system in opening up quite a number of places for Africans. And he went to the villages around Nairobi and elsewhere, wherever he went, to bridge that gap that was there between Kenyans of various races.
I have known some people like Lewis who are so powerfully masculine that young men find themselves find it very awkward to work under them. I'm not saying it's the senior man's fault or that it's anybody's fault in particular, but I think men probably just felt more threatened. They felt as a young person that they would just be engulfed into Louis Leakey's work and personality, and I think to some extent that was probably true. And some of these remarkable women who did work with him just either were willing to overcome that or just didn't have the same feeling.
Well, I think he had this great mind which wanted to find out, wanted to know, knew life was short, knew there weren't enough hours in every day to do the things he wanted to do, that he felt he could contribute. There just wasn't enough time. I think many of us feel that way. Goodness, where can you find the time to find out what you want to know?
One of the things Lewis was very, very anxious to get over to, particularly to young people, and in fact all the audiences he lectured to, was that there could be no possible conflict between science and religion. He found no conflict at all.
Like an evangelist, Leakey toured American colleges to preach human salvation through understanding of humanity's past.
And once man learned to make fire, he entered a whole new world. Fire gave us freedom to think, to develop art and music and religion, to think in abstract terms. It was the last major milestone about 40,000 years ago. Since then we haven't evolved much, physically.
The romance of Africa and the Leakey charm enticed many students. The last one to go into the field with Lewis's personal blessing moved from Beverly Hills, California, to a remote area of northwest Kenya. Elizabeth Meyerhoff lives with the Pokot tribe, studying their traditions and customs for a doctoral degree in anthropology at Cambridge.
Lewis certainly changed the course of my life. I had a certain naive romanticism about Africa. I wanted to learn about something completely different than my culture. I wouldn't say that I'm comfortable. Comfort is a difficult word to use. I'm not sure what comfort means. I'm at peace living here, at peace within myself. I've learned a great deal through Pokot and through my work. I respect the Pokot. I respect their way of life. It's not my way of life. I'm not a Pokot. I never will be. I'm not black. I think I could say the Pokot respect me. I live as they do, and it reaffirms their way of life. They know me as Chamachukwa, and consider me a friend. They're very proud people. They're very honest people. There's a certain beauty which I can't describe. I don't know if it's character or if it's just a complete sort of oneness with nature. I love it very deeply. It's taught me things which I couldn't ever have learned anywhere else about myself.
The values of primitive peoples like the Pokot seem to heighten Leakey's growing distrust of modern trends.
We allow the development of atomic warfare We have no thought as to what we're going to do with our waste products. And we are polluting the air, and the waters of the sea, and the fresh waters, and the land to an incredible degree. We are just wasting our potential. I believe in the future of man. I'm not a pessimist. I believe we can do it. But the time is getting shorter and shorter if we are going to do it. I address my remarks now mainly to the young generation. You, the young generation, have got to see to it that our wonderful heritage, and it is a wonderful heritage, art, music, science, religion, is not lost to us. It mustn't be lost to us. I want my grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-grandchildren after that for another 20 million years to go on developing until they finally reach a point omega. It certainly won't happen if we now fail to appreciate the danger in which we stand. I'm not a pessimist. It can be done. But it must be done soon. Otherwise there is no hope at all for humanity. If you build a strong enough public opinion, not only here, but right across the world, I believe we can. We must save mankind from himself. Now is the time when you must make the choice. Change or perish. Dr. Leakey, speaking earlier today, focused our attention on the importance of the fire in the development of human speech and discussion. I think it may be that the sort of leisure explosion today is analogous to that moment of the fire, and that this is what is happening among the young. And if we think that what is happening among the young may not be always altogether reasonable, we may consider that perhaps some queer things also went on around that primeval fire.
Please, Dr. Leakey.
Unfortunately, my reaction to that one is leisure today is so often centered round the box.
Paul, I need you to close, and I hope to see all of you here tomorrow. Thank you.
When Lewis fell, he hit the back of his head, and I rushed up onto the stage. My recollection is that he was stunned and surprised, but he insisted on completing his lecture schedule. I think the last few years of his life he was subjected to sort of demeaning and debilitating physical experiences. He used to joke about he thought he had more lives than the cat with 9 lives, because he had already had more than 9 life-threatening experiences, and he survived them all. So he, with bravado, would say, you know, I'm going to go on forever. And then on the other hand, he would recognize his frailties, and he would say, you know, I'm a prisoner in my own body. It's a terrible thing, and I used to play tennis, and I used to do this, and I will again someday. You know, he would hold it out for himself as well as for you. But it was also apparent that each succeeding incident would take its toll.
Accidents and illness took their final toll on October 1st, 1972. Louis Leakey was laid to rest beside his missionary parents in the soil of his native Kenya.
I
I think one of the very nice memories I have is of Lewis about 6 months before he died. He was sitting in this room and talking. He had several friends there, and we were all talking about everything under the sun as usual, and the subject came around to religion, and finally it came around to death. And somebody said to Lewis, what do you think about death, Lewis? And everybody who knows Lewis would remember that very often he spoke with his eyes down. But when something really thrilled him, he would look up and his eyes were very dark and brown, they'd sparkle. And that night he was sitting with a glass of whiskey, resting on his tummy and his specs up here. He just cooked a meal. And he looked up and he seemed to be looking far away. He said, death? Why should I bother about death, he said. Death's nothing to me. What'll die? It's only my skin and bones will die. He said, I shall go on forever.